good afternoon, late morning. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Caradina Sale with the Community Technical Assistance Center at the NYU Silver School of Social Work's McSilver Institute. And I want to really give you a warm welcome to joining us today to our webinar called An Introduction to Scalable Psychopathology InteRvention Intensive Training, also known as SPIRIT for ID and Autism. Many children with autism meet criteria for at least one additional psychiatric disorder, and many clinicians may not feel adequately trained to address the mental health needs of youth with autism or intellectual disability. Developed by a group of experts who will be presenting today, the SPIRIT-ID Autism Training Model equips clinicians to treat individuals with autism and/or ID who have co-occurring mental health conditions. This training is grounded in core cognitive behavioral therapy skills and incorporates neurodiversity affirming approaches and autistic lived experience. I will now pass it over to our amazing presenters. I'll let you all introduce yourselves. You are in wonderful hands today with these group of experts who created Spirit. And so I will pass it on to you all. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Kara. So just to let everyone know, you are in for a jam-packed hour, and we're also really looking forward to your questions. We have an ambitious agenda, but what we really want to do is let you know a little bit about some thinking differences and information processing differences that are common in autistic individuals and why it would be important to think about that when you're treating anxiety and OCD. We're going to give you a CBT based model that can help you think about how to approach treating anxiety and OCD when working with autistic individuals and those with ID or co-occurring ID, and then get into some of the nitty gritty about how you would modify traditional CBT with that model so that it's tailored to work with these clients. And then that's pretty much it. Then we're going to move to your Q&A. So without further ado, our team today, I'm going to say Dina Gassner and Lauren Moskowitz are going to be giving you the bulk of information, and then you'll have the pleasure of us all to be with the Q&A. And we are the Spirit team. We designed the content and thought about the delivery, but also we based all of this on sort of the collective wisdom of other researchers, other clinicians, and most importantly, autistic individuals who have been really, really sharing both research-wise and information-wise what's helpful and what works. And so I am going to mute myself and pass the mic to Dina, and we're going to spend a little time, like 5-6 minutes, talking about the next 4 slides.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. And in full disclosure, I'm an autistic researcher, and we as a community have been trying to influence the way we use language in regard to discussing the needs of autistic people to make it more neuroaffirming or more autism friendly and less stigmatizing. So one of the things that you will notice today is, for the most part, we're going to probably stay with the word autism or autistic. Nobody wants to be referred to as disordered, and I know under the medical model that's part of the language, but we again are trying to move the needle toward more neuroaffirming language. So we may just again call it autism or autistic persons. And if we're going to use more letters, we're going to call it autism spectrum condition. The other thing is the autistic community has repeatedly via research reported that they prefer identity first language, which is I am, as I just did, identifying as an autistic person, not a person with autism. It's not a luggage I carry beside me. It's infused into every cell of my body and every cell of my neurology. So we feel that it's kind of disenfranchising, or it suggests that we have to put the autism second, because to put it first somehow devalues someone, and we're kind of taking back that language. Yeah, that's it for a kickoff on that slide. And there are very different ways to consider autism as we're shifting, and at least therapeutically, away from the medical model. It consists of multi-tiered dimensions of thinking differences, processing issues. Quite often we say dichotomous thinking. I am very gifted in language. This is my special interest in my stem and my echolalia that you're hearing in real time. But please don't ask me to turn in my receipts from a business trip. Like, numbers are not my friend. And that's not unusual. Or you'll see the flip of that. Occasionally, we see people like our friend Dr. Stephen Shore, who's just globally brilliant on all sides of his neurology. But mostly the population tends to be a little dichotomous that way. We have social information processing differences. And so, as an older autistic person who has tried for many years to try to anticipate those things, I no longer do that. I'm out, I disclose, and I tell people, if something didn't quite sit right with you, please ask for clarification. Chances are it was just a communication misunderstanding. So, not judging, but asking for clarity. We struggle emotionally when we're trying to process information, or we have too much input coming from all over the world, whether it's cognitive processing or, in the next category, sensory processing. We may have difficulty with our mind-body communication, which we call interoception. And so I'll give you a great real-time example. I went to cumulative stress that they couldn't adjust me. I failed chiropractic today.
So I think Tina, your internet's a little glitchy. So we missed just a touch of what you were gonna say, but I'm gonna forward to the next slide because I
Go
think it
ahead.
also rounds out a little bit more about what we're talking about and everything that you just shared about these differences, why we would want to do therapy a little differently.
So, when we're looking at a youth with autism and or IDD, not all autistics have an intellectual disability, of course. We're looking at some intense interests. The difference between an obsession and an interest, very simplistically, but usually, is joy, right? If something starts to compromise your quality of life, it's maybe something that CBT can help with. But if it's just something that gives you pleasure and joy and it's legal and it's appropriate, interests are great. We like predictability. We like sameness. We need structure. We may have, or more likely will likely have, executive functioning differences. It may be inherent to our autism. We may have co-occurring ADHD. Social information processing, I just described a couple of those. So, just not reading social cues. It isn't that we don't feel and we don't think and we don't have empathy. It's that we may not always understand the need for it when we're experiencing it. We may not see it. All kinds of information processing difficulties can happen with emotional information, and we may have trouble regulating that. We may get overwhelmed easily. And then again, fine and gross difficulties. I have terrible handwriting. I'm always falling down. We just have these motor issues that can be a co-occurring condition. One of which, as an example, is Ehlers-Danlos. Next. So effectively, autism is a different way of experiencing the world. It's
I'll take over for Dina for a second. So yeah, so I think the takeaway is we shouldn't think about that there's anything wrong or broken or that we need to fix in our autistic clients, but more that what they are experiencing might be different than how we're experiencing the world or our neurotypical clients. And we're really encouraging you, as we start to present the rest of this information about how to modify, is considering this alternative way about thinking about autism. And we love autistic people. We love either professionally working with autistic people or personal connections. And we really think that when you shift your thinking, you're going to love working with this clientele as well from a professional space. And Lauren, if you want to now take a little time to tell us like the prevent, teach, respond model and how we're going to use that as a grounding for thinking about modifying CBT with
Sure.
exposure.
Absolutely. And you can actually just go on to the next slide if you want. So in kind of I come from the field of positive behavior support, where we really try to understand when a kid on the spectrum or IDD, or any person for that matter, is engaging in a kind of behavior, we really want to try to figure out, why are they doing that? Why is that happening? In the case of anxiety, which is our focus today, it's often to escape or avoid something that makes you anxious, which all of us do, right? So once you kind of figure out why something's happening, you try to figure out, okay, how can we prevent that from happening? And, we have a huge focus, I think, on prevention strategy. So much of our society is reactive, respond. And the big question I get all the time is, after someone has a meltdown, what can you do? Often it's, I don't want to say it's too late then, but that's not what intervention is. That's crisis management, right? What we want to do is figure out, how can we prevent problems in the first place? How can we change our behavior as teachers, as parents, as clinicians? How can we change ourselves and change the environment to try to prevent problems from occurring, right? And then the other big thing we want to do is figure out, how can we teach people the skills they need to get what they need, right? So when a challenging behavior is occurring, if a kid is being aggressive or engaging in self-injury, it's not happening for no reason. It's happening because they have no better way to get their needs met in that moment, whether that's a need for attention or a need for, to get out of something that's way too difficult for them, a demand that's way too difficult or anxiety provoking, or the need for sensory stimulation or to escape too much sensory input. Whatever that need is, they don't have a way to get their needs met in that moment. So we have to teach them the replacement skills they need. It could be communication skills, coping skills, relaxation skills, distress tolerance skills, the skills they need to help them get their needs met. And then finally, the other thing we have to do, and this is less important in my mind than, prevent and teach, but we need to really figure out how we're going to respond to either anxious behaviors or other, potentially problematic behaviors that come up. How can we respond to it in a way that's really trying to encourage the behaviors we want to see? And by the behaviors we want to see, I don't mean neurotypical behaviors or behaviors that are conforming to neurotypical standards, but rather behaviors that are going to help that person improve their quality of life. How can we encourage those behaviors and help not to encourage or accommodate or reinforce anxious behaviors? All right. So that's the kind of PBS framework. Now I'm going to lead into quickly the CBT framework, cognitive behavioral therapy, because our approach is informed by both PBS and CBT. CBT, it's simply just that our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are connected, right? So if you want to try to change the way we're thinking or feeling, we have to think about all of those things. So if I'm, walking down the street and I see someone I know and they don't say hi to me, I might think, oh, they're mad at me, or, oh, they don't like me anymore, right? That might make my heart start beating fast and feeling anxious. And then I'm going to maybe avoid them the next time I see them. So in CBT, we have to target all of those things. We have to target those thoughts through educating people about what these emotions are, through cognitive restructuring, which maybe just means helping people think about things in a different way, right? Identifying the unhelpful thoughts and helping them think more helpful thoughts. Addressing the behaviors, the primary way we do that is through exposure, which we'll get into soon, or facing your fears, and then reinforcing or rewarding doing things that are really hard for you, and addressing those feelings to some extent, in some cases, using relaxation. You can go. Dina, did you want to start on this, or you want me to? I thought you could be good. Great.
Sure. And please let me know if my internet's better. I moved. Apologies.
Okay. No worries.
So, again, going back to the special interest and the intense passions, instead of trying to repress those, we need to take advantage of those and capitalize on those, because they become very effective as treatments, tools, and supports. Highly motivating. So that's a really good way to do it. They tend to think very concretely, and as therapists, quite often we're guilty of trying to explain and explain and explain instead of just making things black and white the way their brains work. So less words, more specifics, more explicit information. We prefer sameness, and we struggle sometimes with transition. So creating predictability, helping people to anticipate what comes next or what they can expect, erases that blank space, because we have trouble envisioning and imagining what could be coming. So it gives us a great sense of settledness when we have a better idea of what's happening next. We may struggle to transfer information from one environment to another. And so helping caregivers and families to communicate so that those transitions go more smoothly and everybody's on the same page. This is especially important when you have families that are divorced and remarried and there's different households. So trying to maintain consistency is really important. Executive function issues, again, this is like organizing, planning, structuring your day. Recognizing whether someone is a person that has a working memory issue, for example, and has to have things in front of them all the time, or they'll forget them. So adjusting for those sorts of things. Differences in the way that autistic people and not autistic or neurotypical people process reciprocity. I get really uncomfortable when people say, oh, thank you so much, you were so talented. It's like, no, I'm just doing my job. Like, I don't need that. What I do like is more opportunity, right? Instead of more verbal approval for things. It's nice, but I'm not motivated by that. So using video modeling and peer modeling to teach new skills, engaging peers in doing that. Siblings sometimes can also be very helpful at teaching new skills. We can be very rule oriented, and when flexibility is required, that can be problematic, but it can also be a great gift. Sometimes you just have to say the rule is, I have an adult son. I say the rule is you can return a hug, but you can't initiate a hug because the nuances of consent may be too overwhelming or too confusing. And then we just have intolerance of uncertainty and unpredictability. I always say I go to the airport a level 1 and I quickly dissolve to a level 3 when Southwest accused me of lying about my need to pre-board. And so, those situations then become repeated exposures where you anticipate a problem and anxiety can get really high. And you just have to keep reminding yourself, teaching the strategies to remind yourself that it was a one-off and it probably isn't going to happen again. We don't internalize it that way. That's really hard CBT-based work we have to do. Next.
Yeah, and some of this is repetitive, but I think part of the point is why these slides are a bit repetitive is we're really trying to drive a message home. Dina, if maybe you want to highlight 1 or 2 things that you think are really good adjustments in therapy to make sure people are doing, and then Lauren can mention 1 or 2, and then we'll move to the next section.
Well, one of the ones that's not actually here, but is so obvious to me, is making sure when you're marketing yourself as a practice that you're using these neuroaffirming languages, because we're going to tune into that very quickly. And that's what tells us whether a place is safe and whether we're going to be validated and whether people are going to understand the nuances of adjusting for autistic people's needs. But I think the most important part is to just embrace someone as being unique and different and try to help them become their own personal best, however that's manifesting.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with that. I think maybe if just one thing I'll highlight on the slide, which I'm sure we talk about later too. I think to me, the biggest change when I'm working with providers who never worked with someone with autism before is sometimes when they talk to me, they'll say, they keep talking about the same thing over and over again, or I can't get them to focus on what it is I want to teach them. And so some of that is about the provider being flexible too, but figuring out, instead of trying to fight that person and get them to stop talking about the thing they want to talk about, how can we use that to help them understand these concepts better and use that language, their language, the things they're really interested in a way that can capitalize on that, like Gina was saying before. To me, that's the biggest thing I feel like I'm teaching my students all the time.
Great. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty and try to highlight some of these ways with the prevention strategies. You can actually implement different things. We won't necessarily get to all the slides in this section. We wanted to include it in here for you to be able to read more, question more, but we are going to try to cover as much as possible in the next 10 to 12 minutes. Starting, Lauren, maybe you want to talk a little bit about this.
This, I think, is again the biggest modification when you're working with not all individuals on the spectrum, but definitely kids who have an intellectual disability. So traditionally we would just do regular exposure, meaning facing your fears. So when there's something you're anxious about, how can we sort of face those fears in little amounts, right? Like dipping your toe if you're afraid of the water, dipping your toe in when you're ready, going up to your ankle when you're ready, going up to your knees when you're ready. And the key point I also want to emphasize is when you're ready. Nobody should ever be forcing anybody to do anything. It should always, the control and agency should always be with the autistic individual. But one of the big modifications with kids with an ID is often they're not necessarily going to understand a lot of the logic behind facing your fears. So the way we can help overcome that fear is by pairing that anxiety-provoking situation with their special interests, the thing that they love more than anything else in the world. And the example I always give of that is Potato Head, because that was probably the strongest interest I've ever seen, but a kid who was really afraid of the doctor's office, who it would take several adults to hold him down when he went to the doctor's office. And, you know, he was so afraid of it, and he loved Potato Head. His family had actually stopped having Potato Head in the house because they felt it was very distracting to him. But then we had Potato Head live at the doctor's office. We said to him, when you go to the doctor's, you're going to get Potato Head. You're going to get to play with Potato Head there. And it was amazing. As soon as we paired Potato Head with the doctor and we worked up, okay, this time you go play with Potato Head, next time you sit on the examining table, next time you look in your ears, you know, making it a little bit harder each time. But the pairing of Potato Head with the doctor was really able to overcome or surmount his anxiety at the doctor's office. And there's tons of examples like that. Related to that, we don't, in addition to just pairing, we try to figure out how can we incorporate the kid's special interest into the anxiety-provoking thing itself. So my favorite example is a good friend of mine, Dr. Ali Matu. He worked with a kid on the spectrum who was afraid of needles, had a huge needle phobia, but loved Legos. So they were able to incorporate his love of Legos into the fear of needles, as you can see there in that picture. You can go on the next slide if you want. Dina, do you want to talk about this one in terms of predictability?
Sure. So again, the visual cues, the visual schedules, we learned very early on that a lot of verbal prompting, first of all, is the hardest kind of prompt to fade when you're trying to get them to do things more autonomously. And second of all, it just is another form of oral input that becomes overwhelming, especially like in the mornings while kids are getting ready for school. So having a visual chart, pointing to the chart, the prompt remaining, look at your chart, instead of saying, go put your shoes on, fosters more autonomous behavior on their part and lowers the threshold for overstimulation. Again, going over the expectations before you leave the house, before you go to bed at night, anything that will make things predictable for them. You know, using a first then perception of first you have to put your shoes on and then we can go to the store. Or, you know, if we can make it through the whole store, you get a cookie at the end. Those kind of things can be very helpful. Giving timers for transitions. The time timers that are on the internet are very available and they're very helpful. And again, the prompting, the more you can reduce a verbal prompt to a system-driven prompt, the more self-sufficient they get and the more dependent they'll be on systems, which in adulthood is what's going to save them, is being able to maximize systems for support.
100%. Yeah.
Lauren,
Priming is,
I was going to say, Lauren, most specifically in terms of like delivery of therapy and exposure, do you want to talk like just for 30 seconds about priming?
sure. Yeah, that's absolutely. So priming is just an example of how we can make things more predictable. We can do that, like I was saying, with visual schedules, like Dina was saying, with social stories, a whole bunch of things are ways of saying, here's what's going to happen. One way we can do that is video modeling, where you show a model of doing something that's going to happen. But another very related way is priming, where we preview things in real life, or video priming, where basically, again, it's a preview of what's going to happen, but not with a model in it, but from the bird's eye view of that person, what they're going to experience. So I've used this in a lot of situations where kids have a lot of anxiety transitioning, for example, like from one classroom to another. We videotaped, you know, here's what it looks like, you know, from a bird's eye view, here's what it looks like transitioning from this classroom to this classroom, and having the child watch it at home, for example, so it becomes a little less overwhelming and anxiety provoking. Can go to this. Similarly, I think Dina talked really nicely about this, about, you know, we just try to make things capitalize on that kind of rule-oriented nature by making, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, which, if anything, to me is what can make working with autistic individuals a lot easier in my mind, because sometimes all you need is to kind of create these lists of like, okay, here's the things that are going to make your anxiety worse, right? If you keep asking mom, dad, am I going to get sick? Am I, you know, is my face red? All of these questions are anxiety questions that are going to make your anxiety worse. but all the things on the green side are the things you can do. And somehow it disappeared. There's supposed to be a big red cross out over the afraid column, but that really helps, that sense of, I do a lot of that with people, like writing things down and crossing it out. Those are the things we shouldn't do that are going to make things worse, for example. So again, just a way to make things predictable. Was this your slide, Rebecca, too? I don't know if you wanted to say
Did you want to share anything about this, or just basically this is a nice example of how you can visually create predictability so people sort of know what to expect, whether they're in intensive therapy, going to college, orienting themselves?
Exactly. This was my son's weekly schedule. It
Got it.
rarely changed, but just simply going in and requesting this every Monday made him feel more settled and that he knew what was coming next. And I think it is a good example because it just shows how easily we can make a visual schedule without it being overly complicated.
Wonderful. Yeah, I have similar calendars for my own kids, except with a lot more pictures because they're younger. Absolutely. Love that. And another example is we try to convey this through social stories a lot. Social stories are a great way of making a lot of situations more predictable. Here's what to expect when you go to your new school. Here's pictures of your new teacher. Here's what to expect when you go to the dentist. But they can be also a way of explaining the kid's anxiety and explaining the coping strategies they can use. So for the kid on the previous slide we were talking about who had OCD and autism and a mild intellectual disability, his reassurance seeking was constantly asking, Mom, am I sick? Am I healthy? Am I breathing right? Is my face red? So we used a social story to explain to him, here's how you can fight your anxiety. You're not going to ask those questions anymore, right? And if you do ask them, Mom's not going to answer them. Instead, she's going to say, they named his anxiety Undertaker, WWF. So instead, she's going to say, that's an Undertaker question. I'm not going to answer that. Let's do something else. So that's what these pictures were illustrating. And for him, again, that made it way more concrete. He was like, it's crossed out, so I shouldn't ask that. I was like, exactly, right? So it's, again, a way of making, here's what's going to happen, and conveying that kind of psychoed and cognitive restructuring in a very visual way.
Great. Now I was going to say, Dina, maybe you want to talk a little bit more, because I know one of the things is behaviorism sometimes gets a bad rap about taking away agency or control. And one of the things we haven't emphasized yet is that we are doing things with our client, no matter how old our client is, about sort of collaborating on what did they feel ready to do? What did they feel motivated to do? What are their goals? And if you wanted to talk, Dina, just for a touch on this idea of providing choice throughout therapy, but also within each session.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm a married woman, and when we discuss going to dinner, I give my husband the two choices I could live with, and he feels like he's getting a vote in it, when in fact I've been just giving him the choices that work for me. But I think I'm sorry to make a little humor there, but I think sometimes with young people and children, they get so overwhelmed with too many choices.
Totally.
They feel powerless and out of control. So putting choices before them that are manageable, doable, achievable, first of all, teaches them an incredibly important strategy, which is to be confident enough to make a choice. Many of them are so afraid of making a regretful choice that they won't be able to make a choice at all. So the more often we can give them choices, little wins. Do you want fries or do you want mashed potatoes? Would you rather not have a cookie if there's no milk to go with it? Enhances their sense of control. It helps them be more actively engaged in decision making. And I do have to say, too, I think we put this emphasis on thinking that the purpose of this is to help them become independent. And you'll find this group finds that word to be not a very nice one for our population. What we want them to do is to be able to ask for help like everyone else when they need it, from people they can trust and they can depend on. That's very different than making a decision all by yourself. It means partnered collaboration in decision making. And for my son, who's not overly verbal, he can tell me privately what he wants, but he may not be able to execute that at an IEP meeting or with vocational rehabilitation. So it doesn't have to be an autonomous activity. They just need to feel like they're participating at some tier of the process. Does that
Yeah.
help, Lauren?
That is wonderful. And I just wanted to add to that, I think people forget, I talk about this in my undergrad and graduate classes so much. People forget in general, I think adults forget how sucky it can be to be a kid when you have no choices. I think of my 10-year-old telling me the teacher won't let us go to the bathroom, whereas my undergrads, they can just leave and go to the bathroom whenever they want, right? We forget what those little freedoms and choices feel like. So I think we're constantly encouraging teachers, parents to think about, is that really something you need to restrict when there's so many opportunities to give choices that people overlook that then make people feel so much more engaged and motivated and involved and valued again when they're active participants.
Great. I'm going to chime in because Dina said something that I think is huge. We're talking about treating anxiety and OCD, and a lot of times anxiety and OCD symptoms can sort of overlay with some core ways that autistic people think and behave in the world. And Dina, when you said about this idea of like feeling it's difficult to, make a decision or a choice, OCD is often called the doubting disease, right? Like it's really hard and we're always going to doubt our decisions. So in the areas that are clearly not OCD, absolutely 100% emphasizing this skill. These are times where like you really do have the strength and opportunity, and we want to reinforce that. So then when we are in sort of doubting land without any clear answer or decision that could go either way, we can help them hang with that uncertainty. We're actually doing phenomenal on time.
Great.
Proud of us. Why don't we just spend 30 more seconds if you want to? I think with priming, we talked a lot about modeling and prompting already, but maybe if you want to cue us off, Lauren, just with the being a coping model rather than a mastery model, and
Sure.
then we'll move on.
I absolutely will. I just wanted to say one more thing that was super important about choice that I totally forgot. But when we're doing exposures, I think that's a big modification for kids on the spectrum too, is when can we inject choice into the exposures, right? Like if you're doing an exposure to a doctor's office, can you say, do you want me to look in your nose or your ears first, right? So it can really help, because again, anxiety is due to a lack of control, a lack of predictability, a lack of control. So giving people those little ways of control, in a really anxiety provoking situation can be really helpful. Modeling, that's again, you can do that in real life modeling, like I'm gonna let the dentist look in my mouth first before you, or video modeling, or both, right? Let's watch it with YouTube. It's easier nowadays, right, to watch YouTube videos of here's people going to the dentist, of here's people doing this thing, right? With my older daughter, before the dentist, we watched videos of it. I bought all the dental equipment at home. She tried it out on me, I tried it out on her. All of that is modeling. The other thing to emphasize is that I think parents, teachers always feel like we have to be mastery models, right? I'm not scared. I remember a mom once who's a really anxious kid who was saying, I went skiing and I was so scared, but I didn't want to let her know I was scared. I think we have that desire as parents sometimes. But in fact, bravery is being afraid, right? Really being afraid and doing things that are hard for us. So that would have been a great opportunity for the mom to say, you know what, I'm super scared of skiing. And here, I'm going to do it in little baby amounts in a way that I'm comfortable with, to really try to help myself face my fears, if that's in line with what you improving your quality of life in some way. All right, so we went over a lot of prevention strategies. That's certainly not exhaustive. There's way more, but time limited here. So one of the most important things you do, as we've talked about, is to teach replacement skills, to teach people better ways to meet their needs, whether that's communicating. Hey, I need attention. Hey, I need a break. Hey, this is too hard for me. I need some sensory input, whatever it is. Teaching people to communicate, teaching people to approach situations that are anxiety provoking rather than avoid. Again, if that's in line with improving their quality of life, I should say. Cognitive restructuring is a skill, teaching people coping skills, ways of thinking about things differently, in a way that is coping, like I can do this, I can handle this, versus I can't handle this, right? Teaching daily living skills, academic skills, social skills, getting dressed, brushing teeth, executive functioning skills, improving people's planning or organization, problem solving skills, relaxation skills, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness skills, helping people to be more in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. Grounding, we do this a lot with kids, helping them attend to a specific part of the environment so that they don't feel so overwhelmed, for example. Emotion regulation skills. These are just, again, this is not exhaustive, but these are just a list of some of the skills we would teach people to help them be able to get their needs met.
Right. And I think just also that highlighting this end is thinking about these as potentially when expectations don't meet skills level where kids are at, this is when we are going to see frustration. We are going to see big behaviors. We are going to see anxiety. So, also doing like a nice, thorough assessment or like, what are the skills? And also recognizing as clinicians, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who are just sucking in all this information, and I know even as a seasoned therapist, when I'm trying to do this all, sort of figuring out what do I prioritize, what do I do, can often feel overwhelming. Give yourself permission to say, I don't have to do all these skills simultaneously, right? And this is when you're also collaborating with your client. You're really figuring out what's the most important thing that's getting in the way. And so, yeah, and also not overloading our clients by teaching all skills at the same time. And that sort of cues us in nicely for we're going to spend probably the next 7 to 10 minutes really talking about when you're treating anxiety and OCD, sort of the critical skill, which is opposite action or also known as exposure, but how we're going to do it differently. Lauren, would you like to start us off? And then Dina
Sure.
definitely chiming in.
Sure. So again, kind of the most critical ingredient when you're trying to overcome or something that makes you anxious is what we call gradual exposure. And that just means facing your fears, really simple, but in a very gradual way. Again, we are never forcing people to do it. I think that's where a lot of the trauma a lot of people have experienced comes from. A family recently I talked to, the kid who is afraid of water, the kid with autism, his teachers in school had thrown water on them to try to help him be okay with it. That is not at all what we're talking about, just to be abundantly clear. We are not at all exposing people to things that makes them anxious upon them, right? We are encouraging or helping or coaching people to face the things they are afraid of in baby steps at the pace at which they are ready to go. Okay. And the goal, to some extent, I think the old school way of thinking about it is the more you do things that are hard for you, the more you face your fears, you'll get used to it, what we call habituation. And to some extent, that's true. But we also do know from tons of research that folks on the spectrum habituate in a different way than neurotypical people. There might not be that same level of habituation or as quickly. So the focus really is not always on just getting used to it, but tolerating or coping with things that are hard for us. We can do things that are uncomfortable for us. It might be really uncomfortable to do X, Y, or Z, but we can handle it. I can handle it. I can do it. And the other piece I want to emphasize is we only encourage that if it's something they're going to improve, that's going to improve quality of life. Because frequently I will have parents, teachers, clinicians come away from a talk and say, okay, so my kid's afraid of bikes. You're saying I should make them ride a bike. No, that's not what I'm saying. Is there a reason for that? You want to think carefully about what is the reason for this, right? Why are we doing this? Whose life is this really going to improve, right? Before this is something you target. So not all fears need to be faced, okay? And again, we do this in a very gradual way.
Dina, before we move on with the overview and the nitty gritty of ways that exposure therapy is going to be modified, what do you think people should really be keeping in mind that is important as sort of like the grounding, or foundational principle to like think about how am I tailoring, how am I modifying this when working with autistic clients?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that the child is your client, not necessarily a parent. And so sometimes what we have to do is convey to a parent that although they feel like their child is missing out because they're not going to a birthday party or they're not going on the field trip, if you ask the child, they may very, very much not want to do that. And that doesn't mean that they're suffering or that they're missing out, or it means that they're making the choice that's best for them. Can you modify the experience? Can they go to the field trip till they reach their capacity and then go home? Can they wear earplugs? Can they wear headphones? Like, are there ways that we can, first of all, modify the environment before we put demands on people that may be physically painful for them? So I think that's really, really important. And I think always giving them credit for trying, for thinking about it, for weighing their options is so very much important.
Just such a great point. I think we always hold out for perfection too often, adults, right? Parents, teachers, and we really are trying to reinforce any attempts to do things that are hard for us, right? At whatever pace you're ready to go, right? Not everyone moves at the same pace. So I think that's a really key point. One point I forgot to make about the previous slide is the modification for folks on the spectrum. Some of the research has really suggested that for kids on the spectrum, we want to move through the cognitive pieces much more quickly to get to the exposure pieces. That's a better way to do it, basically. Okay. Modifications. So I think we've talked about a lot of these already, but just to kind of explain how we would do it with exposures, like I gave some examples about, like, you would incorporate the special interest into the exposure itself sometimes. So I think we think often about using the special interest as a reward or as a reinforcer, which is also a good thing to do. But there are times we'll need to incorporate it into the exposure itself, like the Lego needle is a good example of that. Or for a kid who was afraid of the dentist recently, like dinosaurs and stars, we actually set up the whole office like a planetarium, like with the, the galaxy thing. So figuring out how can we take the things they love and bring it into the situation itself. A kid who was afraid of dog recently and loved Paw Patrol, dressing up the dog like a character from Paw Patrol, right? Those kinds of things. Like, so actually taking the things they're interested in and bringing it into the exposure is a very big modification. I think we've talked about the rest of these.
I was going to say, Laura, do you want to emphasize maybe this idea of go low and slow and adjusting the pacing and repetition as they're sort of linked together when you're working through exposures?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of folks out there who sometimes want to are afraid of doing exposures because it can be scary to do those. And then sometimes we find the opposite, that sometimes people are really trying to move too quickly at a pace that may be okay for some neurotypical folks, but not, we may need, the research is suggesting we need to go a lot slower and have more repetition often. So the sessions might need to be longer. There might need to be more sessions. There might need to be more of that same content covered across sessions to really get to the same point. Okay. So you just have to start low on the hierarchy. What that means by low is low on the hierarchy. I was saying gradual exposure means you create a hierarchy of feared situations. And so you might need to start really low. If something's too hard for someone, okay, how can we make that task even smaller? How can we make it even easier for them to help them be able to do it?
Lauren, I'm going to jump in if that's okay. Sorry, I'm getting out of my role as moderator.
That's
I
all
think
right.
one of the biggest questions that I often get from like seasoned CBT clinicians who first start working with autistic clients is they say, I don't know if I'm doing it right. I feel like something's stuck. When I really talk about this idea about going slow, both within a session and also over your sort of treatment plan and modifying expectations. I mean, no one really does 6 to 12 sessions anyway, but really thinking about what would be 6 to 12 sessions may actually be 6 to 12 months of therapy. You start to see a light bulb go off therapist's head saying, oh, maybe I'm not like doing this wrong. And you're really meeting the client sort of based on their processing speed, based on their working memory, based on all these other things that are competing for spoons, right? While we're doing exposures that you may have to address, I think is really, really important in this idea of go low and slow. The other thing that I would say go low on the hierarchy is I would never just assume that you've gone as low as you possibly can. Sometimes we need to even go lower on the hierarchy. A lot of times we're not going to use SUDs or subjective units of distress because they're often not meaningful. Everyone's either a 0 or a 10 on a scale of 10. So we're talking about more, what are they willing to do? And I even think sometimes we just do exposures with things that we know aren't necessarily anxiety or OCD provoking, just to start to do the dance and get the rhythm of how are we doing exposures where there's a feeling of confidence and also that we're not taking people out of their zone of tolerance when they're learning this new skill. And that's sometimes also like when we're talking about really starting low. Yeah, we'll move on.
Really quick point, the ritual delay, ritual shortening.
Yeah.
Really, I think that actually relates nicely to what you were saying about going slower, because I think sometimes it may not even be an exposure or like ritual prevention, like you're eliminating a ritual, but how can we at least shorten it? So I'm thinking of a kid once where all of his clothes were always put in quarantine for like a month or something like that. Okay, can we shorten quarantine from like a month to 3 weeks and then 2 weeks, and it was a super slow process of shortening quarantine, right? So I think that's what we're getting at is, if this is too hard, what can we do? And how can we make this even slower and more manageable?
And I think we've talked about a lot of these in general, but really for emphasizing when you're working with clients who also have intellectual disabilities or not autistic, but have intellectual disabilities, what are the biggest things we want to emphasize when we're doing exposure therapy?
Yeah, I think with those kids, we want to incorporate special interests even more and do even more pairing to an even greater extent than I probably would with a kid without ID. The other piece is I might not always need to, I wouldn't necessarily usually use functional communication training when I'm doing exposure, whereas for some kids with ID, I definitely need to. The example I give is like a kid who was having a lot of anxiety in class, and we did need to provide him with break cards, for example. So it wasn't just about exposure, it was how can he take breaks and how can he use those breaks and giving him a certain number of breaks. Or I think I was doing a talk yesterday and a clinician asked me about a kid with separation anxiety in their class who was going to see the mom a million times a day. And they were like, can we just eliminate him seeing the mom? And I said, well, instead, can we give him a certain number of see his mom cards that he can ask to see his mom, and we can, maybe work on cutting those down over time so it's more manageable. So it's an example of figuring out what are the kids' needs, what are they trying to communicate, what are they trying to ask for through their behavior, and then how can we teach them to communicate what they need, right, in a better way. Okay.
Yeah, and before we move on, I know this was slide specific to ID. Dina, just because I've heard you talk before and I sort of know what you emphasize, thinking about kids who maybe are average or above average cognitive and speaking typically in situations level 1, low support needs kids, what would you want people who are attending here to also think about when we're talking about communication and asking for breaks? When we're specifically doing things like exposures, which may up the anxiety and emotional dysregulation purposely.
Well, I can tell you from our lived experience that when they say no, they mean no, and it's okay to just accept that. One of the things that makes us feel safe is knowing that we can stop at any time. And so for us, for example, one place where his no is an absolute is at the dentist, right? If he says this is too much, or I need more nitrous and you need to slow down, or if he squeezes my hand, that's a hard stop. Um, when they get pushed beyond that, before they're ready, they start to shut down and you're going to lose progress. You're going to regress. So encouraging, supporting, explaining the positive aspects of executing the exposure and what will happen after that can be really helpful. But I just have to say, sometimes developmentally, they just come to it on their own. I came home one day and my son, who has a huge phobia, was watching snakes on a plane. So he gave himself his own exposure when he was ready. And the first time we found out about the phobia, he was about 5. His watching the movie happened in middle school. It took him that long to be ready to deal with that exposure. Other things are not so easy. Being afraid to go to the bathroom may require that they go to the nurse's station instead of the big open, echoey, noisy bathroom that all the other kids use. So it's a combination of, what can we do with the environment? How do we make the parents' goals reasonable and appropriate? And how do we prioritize what's essential from what might be learned on their own later on? His inability to tolerate snakes only meant he didn't go to summer camp. It wasn't a life or death situation. Going to the bathroom is a pretty high priority. So, finding solutions for the things that really, really matter is important. I also want to real quickly say, be culturally competent. For example, you may think that going to a birthday party is not a big deal, but in some cultures, like African-American families and Hispanic families, birthdays are massively important family events. So while I would typically suggest that we didn't have to do a birthday, it may not be culturally competent to suggest that in certain situations. So it just requires multifaceted consideration of all the factors as you decide whether to move forward or not.
That's such a great point. Really great point.
And I think, Dina, when you were talking about the bathroom, also making sure even when you're doing in-session exposures, is it sensory safe? Like, we're focusing on the exposure for the OCD and anxiety. We're not necessarily doing any kind of sensory exposure at that point. Talking about, hey, we're starting the exposures, we're doing approach behaviors, we're done with the exposures. What do we want to keep in mind, Lauren, as we're tailoring it for an autistic client?
Right. So I think a few things. Sometimes, you know, I always say to my students, you know, when you're trying to motivate someone to treat the thing they're afraid of, like I think of my motivation to like treat the things I'm afraid of. Sometimes nothing will motivate you because there's no reinforcer as great as escaping the thing that makes you really anxious, right? So we have to think about what will compete with that, right? What will overpower that? And so go with the big guns, you know, give the most powerful reinforcer or reward you can think of, whatever that is. Like for some families, that's things they've even prohibited. Like I'm thinking one family, soda was like, ooh, that would be it for me. So thinking of maybe the thing that your kid has always wanted the most that maybe you haven't considered, but it'll just be for this, for doing these things that are super duper hard. We already talked about reinforcing partial success or attempts. Again, we're not holding out for perfection here. Reinforce any possible attempt towards doing things that are challenging, or just even shortening the ritual. Or like I said before, you know, putting something in quarantine for a shorter period of time. So how can we reinforce any attempts on the way there? And of course, we always, in addition to some sort of activity, reinforcer, like watching a favorite show or a tangible reinforcer, we always give praise, really enthusiastic praise, you know, to accompany that, to really, yeah, motivate people to do things that are challenging for them.
That very specific labeled praise. We don't want to take for granted that for people who are often concrete and literal thinkers, that if we just say, good job, they're going to read between the lines. With the abstract, we want to let them know this is really this one thing that was great and we know was hard. Let's do it again. So let's get specific.
Right.
Seeing
Like,
the
great job
time.
brushing your teeth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Laura, good job brushing your teeth after you ate the snacks before we did the presentation.
Right.
Um, let's just quickly touch upon relaxation for maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, and then we're gonna move on to sort of the home stretch.
Okay. So interestingly enough, a bunch of us, Matt, you know, we've done surveys about what do clinicians do to treat kids on the spectrum. And interestingly, the top thing they do is relaxation to treat anxiety. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's not the most important ingredient. So it's surprising. I think this is people's default always because it's out there in the world. It's out there in the literature, Elmo's belly breathing. And it can be really important and helpful for kids, but it's often not going to be the thing that really necessarily does anything. Right? That's going to be exposure. That's going to be teaching skills. That's going to be other things. Some kids are absolutely, especially when they have ID, they're going to need some coping skills. So they're going to need maybe relaxation to help them get to the point where they're able to face their fears or do things that are hard for them. But, and here's the big but, for some kids, relaxation, or adults, relaxation can end up being contraindicated in that it can, really become what's called like a safety signal or like a crutch, right? And that's I'm thinking of one kid with autism who was having panic attacks, and he had been taught deep breathing, I think, by teachers, previous clinicians. But for him, that they then became another source of anxiety, right? Where he's like, am I breathing right? Am I breathing right? Am I doing it? Is it slow? Am I doing it right? And, you know, we tried to get him off of that to the point where we're like, it doesn't really actually matter how you're breathing, right? You can breathe fast, you can breathe slow, but at the end of the day, anxiety is not going to hurt you. It's just an uncomfortable feeling. It's harmless. You can cope with it. Again, the emphasis is on coping, right? So relaxation can sometimes work against that, but it can sometimes be super helpful. So I think there's just a caution there. Sometimes for some kids, the deep breathing, belly breathing is a better word than deep breathing. Deep breathing make kids think of doctors, but belly breathing or what's called progressive muscle relaxation can definitely be really helpful calm down strategies for some kids. But for kids with autism, it might be a lot of other things. For some kids, it might be specific songs. I'm thinking of one kid where zippity doo dah was the thing that would always calm them down. So for some kids, it could be a specific song or a specific dance or a warm bath. So we really want to figure out what are the things we can do to relax and calm ourselves down, because it may not always be obviously belly breathing.
And let's also not minimize autistic, like sort of natural coping strategies, like stimming and echolalia may be a way that autistic people will find calming down. And we don't want to extinguish those things. If anything, we want to allow them. All right, as we move into the home stretch, I think we're going to talk a little bit about more the C in CBT, the cognitive component, and how we would want to modify it specifically when working with this group.
Sure. So with neurotypical kids and adults historically, I think there's a lot of what's called cognitive restructuring in terms of identifying your anxious thoughts and then trying to challenge them or question them or think about them differently. Some autistic folks, definitely that's super helpful for them to be able to say, you know, do I know for certain I'm going to fail that test? If I fail that test, do I know for sure I'm going to be kicked out of school? And if I'm kicked out of school, like, do I know for sure I'm actually never going to be able to get a job and I'll wind up becoming a stripper, right? Is there any other path other than fail the test and become a stripper, right? You know, probably there's other paths, right? So helping people to think about what are other options, what are other things that might happen can be super helpful. When kids have an intellectual disability, but even a lot of kids who don't have an intellectual disability, all of that cognitive restriction can sometimes be too complex. So it can help much more to just say, okay, here's the coping thought we're going to use instead, or coping self-talk. So instead of saying, I can't do this when I'm going to take a test, I'm going to say, I've done it before, I can do this again, right? And the different thought is really going to be different for each kid. So trying to come up with a bunch of different options to help a kid brainstorm, hey, what's going to be the helpful coping thought for you, right? I even say that to myself when I'm nervous before something. I can do this. I've done it before. I can make it through this, right? So whatever that kind of coping statement is, it can be really simple. I can handle it. I can do it. It can be good if it incorporates their special interests, like back off Trunchbull for a kid who loves Matilda, I'm the boss of me, or thinking of kids who, you know, love Star Wars, back off Darth Vader, you can't make me do this. You're just trying to tell me I'm afraid of this, but I'm really not. So it can really help to teach kids this kind of helping coping self-talk or boss back talk to boss back their anxiety. One last point is Kiefer and Vassar. I love this. I think I love this coping statement from their treatment. Surprises can be fun because uncertainty is such a huge source of anxiety for people with autism and without autism, but it's especially so for kids on the autism spectrum. That uncertainty is especially a triggering of their anxiety. So teaching them coping statements such as, you know, just because I don't know what will happen doesn't mean it's bad, right? Surprises can be fun is the message we're trying to send there. Okay. Dina, did you have anything else to add on any of the coping thoughts or coping self-talks or things that have been helpful for you, or Patrick?
I think one of the things I would want to say is that, and I've never shared this with you guys before, but it just comes to mind that I didn't know that I had the capacity to choose my thoughts until I was a mother of 2 children. You know, I don't think intuitively that autistic people know their thoughts are a choice they can make. And, you know, it is life altering to know that you can, you know, my mantra is what it is, you know, and I don't second guess decisions. My decision making is based on the open door. If I'm welcomed and the door.
Uh-oh. Are you seeing Dina frozen again, guys?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe I'll chime in with sort of piggybacking on Dina and see if she comes back. Yeah, I think part of it is teaching individuals this concrete skill of what do we give attention to and how do we respond to our thoughts. We know that from like inhibitory learning, we're not necessarily getting rid of the anxious thoughts or getting rid of the response. What we're doing is we're building new learning on top of that. So I think what Dina is saying is she may still go into a situation that is very anxiety provoking and wants to go, you have to solve this. This is a catastrophe. And what Dina has now learned is I can respond on top of that with my new learning to it is what it is, right? And through practicing that, she now has this new learning experience of, I have the ability to respond and shift my attention in a certain way and live this valued action. Yes, but I agree with you, Dina, is if we're thinking about in the CBT package, a lot of these things also come from acceptance and commitment therapy, and thinking about the different parts of acceptance and commitment therapy, like diffusion, like mindfulness, and staying with the present moment, and how we can build this in exactly as you're saying, Dina, but really teaching it as these replacement skills. So your internet went out, so I figured I'd piggyback.
Did I come back?
The time. Yeah, you're back.
But I think the point I'm trying to make is, we don't automatically fall back to mantras that can shift our thinking. We have to actively engage in a process of learning them.
It's hard. It's not easy. I'm still working on it for a lot of things, right? It's not an easy thing. The other thing that's also worth emphasizing is the coping thoughts should be just that, coping thoughts, right? It shouldn't be that this is related to what Rebecca was saying, that these situations are not scary, right? So there's a great study on fear of the dark, that the more effective coping thought to teach kids who are afraid of the dark is, I'm a brave boy or I'm a brave girl. I can do this. I can be alone in the dark. I can go to sleep in the dark, versus the dark isn't scary, right? So I think as parents and teachers, we often have that impulse to say, this isn't scary. That's not scary. But you know what? Life is scary. So denying that just makes you seem not credible. Are scary things out there. We live with risk every day. So rather than denying that, just teaching people whatever happens, again, you can cope with that, right?
Yeah, and part of it is like if you know sort of another CBT evidence-based work for anxiety and OCD is space, where you're working with parents. And the idea really behind space is, yes, cutting down on accommodations that are really not encouraging sort of valued living for the kid, and also learning that they can handle it. But this idea of a supportive statement, that we don't sort of put the kid down, you're being a crybaby, why can't you just do this, suck it up? But we're also not wrapping our kids up in bubble wrap and protecting them in a bubble. We're basically validating, saying is, I know handling the dark is scary, and this makes a lot of sense. Like, lots of people are scared of the dark, but I also have confidence that we can get a good night's sleep and sit here for 5 minutes alone in the dark, and then I'll come back in and check on you.
Right.
And doing that. We're almost rounding out to the Q&A. We have a couple more slides that maybe we want to talk to about, thinking about when we're incorporating caregivers and either like school staff, what do we want to emphasize, as well as therapists, on how to respond, I think, along with sort of the supportive statements and what else.
I think we said a lot of the things on this slide already, so I won't repeat the things we've said. But I think one of the big keys, and Dina alluded to this before on one of the first slides about modifications, is a lot of treatments out there for anxiety for kids. Actually, you're just meeting with the kid alone as a clinician, right? Like something like Coping Cat, it's basically with the kid alone, and there's very little parent involvement, except for every 4 or 5 sessions or whatever, very minimal. That's not what we do for kids on the spectrum, right? Parents are involved either in every single session, maybe the second half of the session if the kid wants some time alone, or there's a separate group for parents than for kids, like in a group treatment, Facing Your Fears. But parents have to learn every single thing you're learning as a therapist to be able to help coach their kids at home. Sometimes teachers need to learn that too. So really helping the adults in a kid's life to figure out, how are we going to change the environment to better suit this kid's needs? How are we going to help coach this kid? And because I think that's what parents need the most, help and coaching. Like I said, despite even what I know as a therapist, sometimes when I'm a parent, I get frustrated and I fall into that language that could be invalidating. Oh, we just went through this yesterday. Can't we do this today? And so it's so important to really be working with the parents about it's a really tough line to validate. I know this is so hard for you, and I know you can do it, right? To help parents validate their kids' anxiety, and as well as reinforce their confidence in their kids' ability to do things, rather than either being critical or dismissive or helping them to avoid or accommodate. It's a really tough balance, but that's the biggest thing you're really trying to help parents to do, and teachers.
And I would say, Dina, I'd love to hear, also knowing that often neurodivergence runs in families and parents might not always be diagnosed themselves, thinking about all the prevention strategies that we talked about when we're incorporating caregivers in. What do you think is important for people to keep in mind if they may be working with like neurodiverse families?
You're reading my mind. I was just going to say that, the generation I grew up in, my autistic behaviors would be considered inappropriate, unacceptable. My directness, my straightforward delivery of information is very overwhelming to people. And so if I'm a father or a mother parenting another neurodivergent child, often out of tenderness and love, not wanting that child to be harmed in society, they may become quite overbearing because they were never given permission to be unique or be different. So helping parents to do that. I did want to touch base and just say, I stepped out of turn here and I posted a link to a Tony Atwood emotions book. So, I just have to acknowledge that on the recording so people know it's there. We're going to give it to you later. Lastly, I would like to say too that it's just really, really important to understand the language piece. The reason we prefer autistic is when you say person with autism, it's as if you're saying we can't be a whole, complete, valued person with our condition. And what we're advocating for is to be able to identify as an autistic person because we want to be perceived as a whole person, including our condition. And I think that but again, about cultural competence, maybe not every family's been advised about their options. Maybe well-intentioned parents and support group members or teachers told you that person with autism is better. It's important to remember that didn't come from autistic people. It came from parents who didn't understand how important a whole identity, a gestalt identity that's complete is, that includes the disability. So we don't want to repress that. We want to embrace it. We want to celebrate it. We want to lift it up and focus on the strengths as much as we can by helping people manage their challenges as well.
And I would even say thinking about dropping the D. I know it's quicker to write ASD than autism, especially when we're writing notes and we're pressed for time. But really thinking about people are coming for treatment of anxiety and OCD. They're not coming for treatment of autism, and for us to really shift and think that that's not like the disorder. You may want to, in the same way you would have a conversation about, what are the pronouns that you use? What is the identity language that you would want to use? Also, just letting people know, for insurance reasons, I'm going to have to put ASD because that's how you're going to get the reimbursement, or this is what's going to show up on the super bill. But for the sake of when we're talking, I'm using the word autism and just making sure.
And again, based on a question in the chat here, everybody's allowed to choose their identity language. We absolutely have to respect what someone projects they want. So it's just like LGBTQ identity language. How do you identify should be one of your intake questions so that you can be respectful of whatever the cultural perception on identity language is for that individual. Some people can't just they think of their autism as part of who they are. I personally experience autism in everything I do. So I think it's beyond that for me, but that doesn't mean everybody has to align with me. I'm just trying to communicate to you as providers to be sensitive to that difference of how people want to be perceived and ask for clarification and then honor that.
Can I jump in on that as well?
Yes.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, and I think just another piece to keep in mind is just like, we're talking about kids primarily in this talk, and just like all other aspects of identity, this process can be developmental too. So how somebody identifies, how that becomes whether or not that is sort of integrated into their identity in the way that Dina is talking about, or doesn't feel like it's part of them, or may not even be a word that folks feel comfortable with. Again, that's going to evolve over time. And I think our point here is not to make it a hang up that all of a sudden impedes your ability to have a good therapeutic relationship, but rather to be responsive and open about it so that it can be part of that relationship wherever they are at that time.
Great. So I've put up the visual prompt to say is, hey, we're shifting to the Q&A. So we've already gotten some great questions, which are I think being put in the chat and then popped internally for us. We encourage you. We know you were probably laser focusing on what was being said. pop more questions into the chat. We'd really like to get to them all. I'm going to start with probably a general question that maybe we can give a quick answer to. And then I see that there's a really good sort of, I think, OCD specific question. But when thinking about autistic differences like alexithymia, having difficulty, or maybe having autistic empathy that might be different than neurotypical empathy, and knowing that exposure work is going to be in the world of emotions, frustration, anxiety, disgust. What are some skills or things that we may need to do before or simultaneously engaging in exposures? And I would open that up to our panel.
But I can. If you want.
Laura, you want to jump in? And then I think it goes along with Dina's resource that she had put in about, doing some emotion identification. But Lauren, what would you be specifically doing that maybe the neurotypical, I would say CBT therapist is not thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the interest piece again. Like I'm thinking, like let's say video modeling, for example. Like one of my kids who was afraid, had blood tests phobias or blood injection phobias. For maybe a neurotypical kid, we could just watch videos of that on YouTube of people doing it first. For her, she wouldn't even watch any of those videos. So for me, I went to go get a blood test and filmed myself doing it and talking about the things she likes so that she would watch the video. So then she did, right? So think those are some of the things we might need to do to get a person to the point where they're ready to do exposures. Like how can we incorporate things that are going to motivate them, whether that's people, certain people who they're more likely to maybe do things for, or certain places or certain videos. I think the use of video can be really helpful. I video a lot of things and play it for them. Videoing themselves doing certain behaviors, video self-modeling can be really helpful. Open to other thoughts.
I also wanted to add kind of in relation to a question that came up in the chat that Dina shared a resource for around kind of, how do we, address kind of alexithymia or difficulty, understanding or identifying emotions. And I think with any therapy targets, the first step is kind of taking a step back and like, what is the reason why we are targeting or, a particular skill? What I have seen a lot of times with clinicians, if they are kind of using a CBT manual and like the first step, usually is like in Copycat is emotion identification, and they get stuck in, we're now doing emotion identification forever, and we don't ever get to the active part of the intervention, which is the exposure. So it's thinking about if the goal is identifying emotions and understanding someone's levels of emotions and the psychosomatic symptoms because you want them to be able to understand their body cues, or like if that's related to the goal, then kind of working on emotions. But if we're thinking about if our target is approaching anxiety, provoking situations or addressing OCD, sometimes whether or not someone has the exact right word or different levels, like you can use kind of people's own language. Like they don't need to have kind of, perfect kind of like differentiation of, scared versus fearful versus terrified. What's important is that they have their own way of kind of communicating and conveying. And it may even just, a lot of times with being black and white and like I said, it may just be like, yeah, like this is, I'm good to go. And this is like, no, I don't want to do this. And then figuring out kind of like the no, I don't want to do this. What are the things that can make it easier, that it's more likely you might want to try as a way to work up the hierarchy. But kind of like Rebecca alluded to before, is like getting lost in like the SUDs, those subjective units of distress. It's more kind of using people's own language and anchors to make something easier or harder, and sometimes it may be differentiating, like, is this a I don't want to versus this feels hard versus this feels scary, is kind of sometimes I'd say like not getting lost in the weeds of the emotion identification if that's not core to the target behavior that you're working towards.
Okay, can I jump off that as well and just say,
Yeah, just looking, we
I-
have other questions to get to.
yeah, yeah, but I think it'll maybe a good sort of subtext to keep in mind. And Natalison's point about, you know, not getting lost in the weeds and sort of being functional. The other thing, as Rebecca said at the beginning, right, the alexithymia, difficulty reading one's own emotions, is common in autistic folks, as is difficulty reading other people's emotions. And those two things, the research tells us, can be correlated, but are not the same. And so it's a matter of sort of which one at the time that you need and want to focus on, right? So if it's like identifying, you know, feeling anxious or feeling angry, right? You know, as Allison said, that you can get stuck for months in, well, what about other people's anger and my anger, and how do they relate? And I think being really specific about why do I need to know, what do I need to know with this, and what level of articulation or expression of it is useful for that person to address that goal, without feeling like you need to tackle all of it.
Yes. Yeah. Great. I'm going to quickly pose the question and answer it because I think it's a very simple one. Someone was saying, can you use all of these strategies for older kids and teens? And I would say yes, and adults too. I work with individuals across the lifespan of all ages, and I'm constantly doing all of these things. So I think yes, finding ways to make things developmentally appropriate, but incorporating this constantly, and even with non-autistic folk, but other neurodivergent folk, like people who are maybe more ADHDers, will also sometimes benefit from some of these things. There was a question that said, do we have recommendations for patients who have anxious thoughts but aren't going to share them because they're afraid it will come true if spoken aloud? And to me, this sounds very much like sort of a common phenomena that we see in OCD, this idea of magical thinking. If I don't do something to neutralize a thought, or I don't do this compulsion, or if I do this thing, then this magical thing will happen. So I really think, just to say, is there's some good like guidance already in sort of OCD treatment of how we would address it. I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts. What I would say is one of the ways that I often attack magical thinking, both in neurotypical and autistic clients, is I start with positive things, right? Because if there's this phenomena of magical things, then we should definitely be able to also channel and harness it for positive things and playing around with it that way. And often that gives me a little space. You know, everyone sort of chuckled, but it also then I think taps into the humor of the client for them to have maybe a willingness to experiment or do things. But I'm curious what other people would do, especially knowing that our autistic clients are concrete, especially knowing this higher intolerance for uncertainty, especially knowing like it's hard to sometimes see what's unpredictable in the future. How would you sort of go along with this? Yeah.
I can start. So, yeah, kind of, similar to what Rebecca was saying, kind of the idea of, right, starting with testing out that idea, that theory that if we say something aloud, we can make it true. We can, doing behavioral experiments around, all right, if I say, I'm going to win $1 million today, I said it out loud, I put it in the universe, did it happen? And kind of doing those positive experiments to have the experience that as much as maybe we'd like it to be so, kind of saying something out loud does not make that occur in the occur. And the question had also been about kind of the use of can we use kind of different like coping strategies, and kind of coming up with different coping thoughts if we don't know what the particular thought is. And so along those lines, we can start teaching that skill of coming up with a coping thought or a more helpful thought with using examples. So kind of, and this can be a nice time to kind of incorporate interest again in terms of bringing in, characters that they like that they may like from books or movies, and kind of going through, if this person, you know, is thinking this, you know, is anxious about this thing, what could they tell themselves to help themselves feel better or to be more successful in that situation? And that, you know, to try to, you know, that can kind of work on starting to teach the client about what is something I could say to myself, even if they're not ready yet to share what that fear is. Because we don't, you know, envisioning a hierarchy, probably saying it out loud is going to be really high and really hard for them. We're not going to ask them to do that first without giving them some tools of when they start doing that, how, you know, how to handle it. You know, and then it may kind of be eventually working up to saying that thought out loud. I would also say, just kind of on a related note, with kind of when adapting, using kind of coping thoughts and helpful language with fears, a lot of times, you know, particularly the autistic kids that I work with have a heart, they can identify that they're scared and avoidant of something, but can't always, there's not always like a particular thought attached to it, that it's not, there's not a feared consequence. It's not that, if, you know, it's just, I know I, you know, don't want to, you know, approach this or do this, or it gives me a really, you know, aversive kind of, the idea of doing XYZ thing kind of, or being in this situation gives me a really aversive reaction. And so kind of also not getting lost in the weeds of trying to find kind of a perfect coping thought for that situation, that you can kind of come up with broader, you know, practice makes perfect, or, you know, kiddo who like was really into Star Trek, so kind of like be like Spock and be logical. You can kind of come up with, you know, with the client with different things of coping thoughts that would be helpful across a variety of circumstances, as you're either in the situation of working up to them being comfortable saying the thought out loud, or also if they don't have a specific thought associated with the situation, and it's more just kind of working more broadly to what are things that we can say to ourselves that are helpful, that can help us, you know, in situations kind of approaching such things that make us nervous, but that, you know, we may have to do or want to do.
Did you want to add to this? I want to maybe get to one more question, but I know that you had wanted to say something in response to this question.
Yeah, I just I wanted to also amplify the point that you had talked about, Rebecca. It was something kind of implicit in some of our presentation, but I want to highlight, which is you know, the value of absurdity and silliness as a way to counteract some of that cognitive rigidity. I use probably one of the strategies I use the most and like the most is, you know, saying, all right, you know, if you can't tell me this particular thought, you know, is it that, you know, let's try some, you know, a jello filled comet is going to crash into the earth right now when I think it, and say, right, like something that it is so unambiguously clear that it can't possibly be true, kind of can create a permission structure for then thinking about things that might otherwise feel scary to say, and doing it in a way that is silly, that is playful, that can be game-like, you know, which of course, for many of you who are child therapists, you know, you're used to thinking about how do we make things playful and game-like. Can not only, you know, be reduce the SUDs, but actually you know, allow for that entry, even if they can't talk about that specific thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Such a good point.
I see two more questions that maybe we can squeeze in an answer to. The other just last thing that I was going to say to when the thoughts aren't even voiced. There's so much shame in OCD, and there's so much shame sometimes being an autistic person in a neurotypical world. Sometimes that I feel like just normalizing things. So using a checklist like a PSI box and just saying, letting a person know there's lots of people who have these thoughts. We got a whole list of these, right? Can often sometimes a person's willing to say, yeah, maybe I got a thought. I'm not telling you anything about the content of it, but you can like check that box, can often be helpful. I see questions about accommodations, and I know we didn't really talk about that last slide. If we want to maybe highlight what is the difference between accommodations that serve an autistic client's thinking and accommodations that we want to either cut down on or eliminate that are in the service of what OCD and anxiety are really wanting. And do we always have to eliminate all of those accommodations? I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on accommodations, and then we'll get to our final question about how do we loop in caregivers and school staff who maybe are a bit resistant to doing things differently. And then we'll sort of end. But first, the accommodations question.
I can, if I can just jump in, I would say that unfortunately, especially with kids who are high verbal capacity, when the way they externally present is counterintuitive to what they need, people tend to push them beyond their capacity. So for example, you know, I'm presenting with my masking for this event and everything, but you know, that doesn't mean I still don't need the accommodations that I received to make me effective here today. You know, here's what happens with that population. I don't know if they can see, but there's a void between one's cognitive awareness of their true capacity and what they can functionally execute without supports. And what the accommodations do is they close that gap. I also am a big person in favor of not right now. It may not be something they can accomplish today, but you don't say you don't ever have to do that. You say not right now. Maybe we can approach this another day. In terms of buy-in, again, I fall back to logic and reasoning. If you're not giving a child prompting and reminding and supports, and it's taking you an hour to get out the door with a huge meltdown, my question when people don't buy in is, how's that working for you? You know, if it's not working for you, maybe you want to rethink your buy-in, because I can tell you, let's give it a try. Let's just try this for a week or 10 days or until the next appointment and see if it gets better. 90% of the time, the supports do make it better, and it makes the next tier of buy-in more available to you as a provider.
Yeah, I would say Lauren, Matt, Allison, anything you want to address about accommodation or also working with other providers, school staff, parents who maybe are ambivalent at best, resistant at most challenging.
Well, the thing I'll say always is that there's usually so many things that are going on. To tell parents or teachers don't accommodate is also unrealistic and ridiculous. Like, we're always, like, as a parent myself, you know, dealing with a neurodiverse child who's 10, like, I accommodate things every day. I have to prioritize what is the thing I'm going to focus on reducing my accommodations for, right? Like, we're always all talking about, I can't fight every battle. I'm not going to die on this hill, right? And and those are the conversations I have on teachers, that you've all heard me say this when they're like, she's not wearing a uniform. I'm like, I can go all in on that. But is that the hill you want to die on? And often teachers or parents will say to that, okay, I see where you're coming from. Maybe wearing her scrunchie in her hair isn't the hill we want to die on, right? So you can sometimes make progress just with talk of prioritizing, you know, what accommodations we're going to focus on, right? Is one thing I would say.
Yeah, I think just to echo Lauren's thought is that I think when talking about accommodations, a lot of times, particularly in the concept of anxiety, it's thought about accommodating the anxiety and kind of conceptually thinking about that differently than, you know, accommodations that an autistic person needs for, you know, due to the disability associated with autism. And, you know, for kind of any therapy goal, you know, especially working with children, right? You know, tools and skills that we're teaching, you know, are, you know, the goal is to kind of promote an eventual independence, but kind of we need to kind of prioritize, you know, what's interfering, what kind of supports are needed in the moment to help, you know, someone survive. And right, someone maybe is going to be more independent in a situation with, you know, headphones on because it's less distracting. That's not an accommodation where we want to take away versus, oh, it's, you know, something's being completely accommodated and, you know, we're not going to school because the kid says that they're scared. And maybe we need to work more towards, okay, can we start approaching something that we have to do? But yeah, just, I guess, wanted to differentiate between kind of anxiety accommodations and kind of disability, other sorts of, school-based accommodations that,
Great.
are in the IP, are in, kind of legally or kids are required for.
Kara, I want you to be able to let everybody know about the upcoming CTAC events. For people who want to learn more, and potentially some things run by CTAC and maybe privately, you're welcome to reach out to us and for upcoming trainings. But there's also some very specific upcoming CTAC events that are very important. So Kara, thank you for giving us the space to talk about our stuff. I want to give you the space to talk about your important stuff.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. This was amazing. We have a feedback survey that's in the chat, so please complete it. Vanessa, will you just put that in one more time, please? There will be a link from Vanessa, so please fill out our survey. We are working with the Office of Mental Health to continue to work with this amazing SPIRIT team. Is that okay if I call you the SPIRIT team?
Sounds nice.
Yes, to think about future training, because this was just a little introduction, right? But I do want to just, sorry for, we are going to wrap up. These are upcoming events. Youth and technology, we had a part 1 last week. Part 2 will be next week on November 13th. This is a really important event around thinking of youth and technology and risk and protective factors around what they're exposed to and what we can as a collective do, right? Breaking barriers, understanding and combating mental health stigma among children, youth, and families. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then we are going to be talking about treating youth fire setting behavior on November 21st from 12 to 2. That concludes our time together, everyone. Thank you so much to the SPIRIT team. Thank you, everyone, for all of your great participation, questions, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.